Okay, so warm welcome everyone to this seminar on the topic I Will Shake All Nations, Theological Perspectives on Nationalism and Universalism. My name is Jayne Svenungsson. I'm a professor of systematic theology at Lund University in Sweden. And this is a joint seminar involving, on the one hand, the Nordic online academic network Resonance, and on the other hand, the international, it's international too, but it's above all interdisciplinary research platform Christianity and Nationalism, which is based here in Lund. And before introducing our two speakers, and I will keep this very brief, I just want to say a few words about each of these two networks. Resonance, as some of you, probably many of you already know, was launched this spring, and it's an entirely internet-based academic network, which aims at facilitating exchange between Nordic scholars working in the broad field of political theology. And I will later on, if someone else doesn't want to do it, I will post the homepage address for those of you who have not yet found it, because it's an excellent way to exchange information. You could post news about events, about publications, about anything. So it's really aimed at keeping Nordic scholars and others beyond, of course, but in particular Nordic scholars in touch with each other and to be able to share informations. And also Resonance hosts regular online seminars, and this is the second. So the first was launched in May. And this is the second, and there will be at least one more this term. Secondly, Christianity and Nationalism, which was also launched last spring, or perhaps rather last winter, in January, and it is of slightly more physical nature this time. So we have learned to live and dwell in this virtual space, but it's physical in the sense that it consists of a core group of scholars which are based here at Lund University from an array of disciplines: theology, philosophy, church history, gender studies, law, etc. And it was set up as precisely this interdisciplinary research platform to examine and interrogate interdisciplinarily the complex ideological, social, and other interactions between Christianity and nationalism that you can see today at various levels. But it also, of course, has an historical aspect. So we are also interested in historical examples of Christianity and nationalism. And this platform, especially since it was launched during the pandemic, also is very much, well, still so far it has almost only been an online based activity. So we have also a seminar series for at least four formal seminaries per semester, and this is well, the second semester that we are running, which means that this is our fifth seminar, and this brings us to this particular seminar and topic, because well, given that both networks are new and both have a focal point in or on political theology and gathers people interested in political theology taken in this broadest sense, we decided to join forces, and I say we because I'm engaged in both networks, and to organize this seminar on theological perspectives on nationalism and universalism. And to this end, we decided to give the word to two fascinating younger voices in contemporary Nordic political theology, and this brings me to our two speakers. First, warm welcome to Ragnar Misje Bergem, who is a postdoctoral fellow in systematic theology at the MF Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society. He holds a doctoral degree from Cambridge University, and it is Ragnar, above all, who should be credited with initiating the resonance network. He was the one who first dropped or took the initiative and gathered scholars from the other Nordic countries to a board, and now we have this fine network. And I can also say you can also sign up to be a member of the network. It's entirely free of charge, and then you could put it in your CV, so whatever you wish. Warm welcome also to you, Mårten Björk, who is a postdoctoral researcher in systematic theology here at Lund University, where you, because I look at you, are the PI of an interdisciplinary research project called the End of Law, which involves both jurists and theologians. You're also a junior research fellow at Campion Hall at Oxford University, so you kind of commute, I think, this semester, but not only between Lund and Oxford, because in addition to all this, you currently have the lectureship at Uppsala University, where we will be teaching in the years ahead. So warm welcome to both of you, and we will proceed as follows. Mårten and Ragnar will each give a brief lecture of think about 20 minutes each, and then we will open the floor. And I suggest that we just use the chat functions. You just write your names, and then I will just name my name. So rather than using the virtual hands or waving. I think that was all. So again, warm welcome, and we haven't decided whom of you should start. So Mårten or Ragnar, did you discuss this between you?
Did we discuss that?
Mårten, if you want to go first.
Yeah,
then,
I can do that. Yeah, let me just share. Yeah, can you enable me to share the screen, perhaps?
Yeah.
Okay, so do you see the PowerPoint? Yeah. So my talk will be about the anthropology of theology and the anthropology and theology of nationalism. And I should say that I wrote it in Swedish, and then I realized, oh, I have to translate it to English. I did that in the last minute. So if you see any strange things in English, like the small t, yeah, you know why. Anyway, so the first premise of this talk is that there have not always been nations. In other words, what Benedict Anderson called imagined communities that unite people around a set of allegedly national characteristics, such as country, language, culture, family, etc. Land, language, and culture are not imagined, of course, but real and material phenomena. But when they become the building blocks of a national symbolic culture, they generate specific national representations. It is in this sense nations are imaginations, and imaginations are obviously part of the real. I mean, many things that structure our lives are related to what we dream, what we imagine, what we believe, what we hope, and so forth. And we have the famous philosopher Alexis Mainon talk about the Außer sign, that which is beyond being, such as imaginations. So imaginations are part of the real, but they are not real in the sense of material phenomena. The concept of nation, from the Latin natio, birth, but also race or class, indicates that we belong to our origin. We are creatures belonging to history and to our specific national history, rather than to eternity or the future. Or rather, concepts like eternity, history, and future are nationalized according to the anthropology and even theology of nationalism. So national representations are anthropological. They say something about who we are as human beings. For example, the Israeli philosopher Yoram Hassoni, a very popular thinker nowadays among various Christian groups, He says that we humans are national. We belong to specific groups, specific tribes, and these can be called national. Thus, if we are to believe Hassoni, human beings function best in national communities. And while supranational communities may be needed, they must be founded in and through national communities. And this is a quote from his book, The Virtue of Nationalism. The nationalism I grew up with is a principled standpoint that regards the world as governed best when nations are able to chart their own independent course, cultivating their own traditions and pursuing their own interests without interference. This is opposed to imperialism, which seeks to bring peace and prosperity to the world by uniting mankind as much as possible under a single political regime. Against, for example, the German Jewish philosopher Franz Rosenzweig's hope for what he called the Mitteleuropa, or even a new Levant in essays such as Globus, or Hermann Cohen's understanding of monotheism's discovery of the idea of humanity, that is an idea of what is common to humanity. Hassoni argues that the national idea is anti-imperialist. It is against empire, since imperial thought seeks to create a harmonious world order. But according to him, it can only lead to disasters. So fascism and Nazism, for him, are imperial ideas, not national. Humanity is anthropologically bound to small and thus national communities, according to Hassoni. And this is, of course, an anthropology, but it also implies a theology. And Hassoni distinguished what he calls the Protestant condition, which for him means a struggle for national self-determination, from the Catholic Empire. So,
Mårten, sorry for interrupting you. I get several messages in the chat, and it seems like people have problem with seeing the PowerPoint, or if it's just that we forgot to change slides.
Now it has changed.
Okay,
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay. So should I have it like this then? Because I changed slides, but now I don't. Okay. Anyway, so his analysis of the Reformation is the birth of nationalism. So the Protestant condition implies for him a struggle for national self-determination, and he distinguished that from the Catholic Empire. This, he argues, does not imply an anti-Catholic bias, as Catholicism today has often become a national culture and thus a religion adapted to the nation rather than empire. So even Catholicism is becoming national. And Hassoni shares Benedict Anderson's idea that the nation must be separated from the religious and imperial dynasties that characterized antiquity and the Middle Ages, like Christian empires, the Ummah of Islam, Buddhist empires, and so forth. And Hassoni and Anderson also agree that nationalism can be classified as religious or theological, since nationalism provides answers to existential questions such as death and the meaning of existence. And it's interesting to note that Benedict Anderson, who probably many of you know, was an anarchist, great scholar of Southeast Asian cultures, a brother to Perry Anderson, perhaps more famous, the elder brother. And his book, Imagined Communities, is a classic in the studies of nationalism. And Hassoni is, as I said, an Israeli philosopher on the right. But both of them have this idea of the nation as something that arises against the empires of the world, so to speak. And they also agree that nationalism gives answer to what they both call religious questions or theological questions. Religions, Anderson argues, in Imagined Communities, respond to, and I will quote, obscure intimations of immortality, generally by transforming fatality into continuity, karma, original sin, etc. In this way, it concerns itself with the links between the dead and the yet unborn, the mystery of regeneration. So according to Anderson, religion is born from the need, from the anthropological and sociological and psychological need to confront questions such as birth, death, the linking between generations, the relation between my life and the life to come, and the life of past and future generations. So it's a way of linking and creating, linking and thereby creating imagined communities that go beyond the present time and the specific place that one lives in. So a religion, so religious empire or world religion, like, I don't know, Catholicism or Buddhism, link people together in wholes of communities that are much larger than the national community. Yet the religions differ from nations by linking this continuity and belonging to another world, namely the world of God, or the world of gods perhaps. Whereas nationalism grounds immortality and the hopes, our hopes, in the continuity of the people and in the, so to speak, afterlife or survival of the state of the nation. And one example of this is the tomb of the unknown soldier. It should be soldier. So we have a tomb of an unknown soldier there. For Anderson, that is a good example of a form of secular belief in immortality. That is an idea that there is an afterlife in the nation, in the collective life of the nation. And it's interesting that Benedict Anderson discusses immortality in his book on nationalism, since that's perhaps not what you think that you would find when you read this book, but it has an interesting discussion on immortality. And this is related to what Hans Blumenberg has described as the transformation of the concept of immortality to a this-worldly concept during modernity. So during the modern period, that is during the rise and the emergence of modern national states, capitalist markets, economy, and so forth, immortality, the concept of immortality does not exactly disappear, but it is moralized and immanenticized. It is related to this world, like the tomb of the unknown soldier. So there is a form of secular or even national immortality in the concept of remembrance. We remember the dead. We don't know who these dead soldiers are. There are just too many, but all of them belong to the collective life of the nation. So Blumenberg argued that at the same time as immortality is pushed forward by Lessing, Kant, and Herder to the point of the idea of reincarnation in the modern era, it is also moralized. The change is radical, if at the same time easy to overlook, since immortality has always involved an ethical and a political dimension. Mortality has always involved in relation to what a good life is, how society should be structured, how we should live. Just look at Plato's The State, the Republic. It ends with the myth of air, which is a myth of reincarnation and the theory of immortality. So immortality is essentially a political concept. But Blumenberg continues, with the modern discussion on immortality, it is no longer God who is the primary object of one's attention in the beyond. On the contrary, that attention continues the theoretical interest and moral obligations of this world. That is, it loses its quasi-worshipful character so as to satisfy instead what one's finite individual life denies. So, for instance, all of the unknown soldiers who perhaps decide, I don't know, survival or glory, or I don't know, yeah, probably just to survive the war. They are giving a form of survival in the afterlife or in this collective remembrance. So this is the change of immortality. It is no longer related to God, but to the survival of this life, so to speak. So the legitimacy of a modern theory of immortality is now found in the intersection between a moralization and a de-theologization of the world that is parallel with the view on life as primarily a biological and immanent phenomenon, or for that matter, a national phenomenon. It would be really interesting to discuss the relation between the growth of evolutionary theory and nationalism, but that's another talk, perhaps. So when life becomes national, eternal life also becomes related to the state and the world of the nations. And according to Hassoni, but according to Hassoni, the roots of naturalism goes back to the constitution of the human as a human. The human is anthropologically national. And the Jewish God is, according to Hassoni, a God for a specific nation, the Hebrews, Israel. This God created the world and is obviously the God of all, but he seeks a communal and national relation to humanity. And this is what Protestantism implies for Christianity, according to Hassoni, the discovery of a national form of Christianity beyond the Catholic Empire. Yet, from the perspective of Jewish thinkers like Cohen and Rosenzweig, and Christian thinkers such as, for instance, Erik Peterson, this is a perspective that necessarily de-eschatologizes the messianism of both Jewish religion and Christianity. Hope that I have time. Yeah. So Cohen and Rosenzweig insist that the revelation to Israel is a revelation of a possibility for all peoples to exist in relation to God as a unified whole. Should be needed. A common humanity. This does not mean assimilation, but it implies the possibility of coexistence in a common state, perhaps what we could call an empire of creatures. Cohen was a defender of a multicultural nation. He was a nationalist and a socialist, a social democrat and a German nationalist, but he believed in a multicultural nation. And Rosenzweig was a staunch defender of a world beyond the state and the nation. He hoped for a constitution of a European community, and that would even extend into the North Africa, a form of imperialism, actually. And in the Stern der Erlösung, the Star of Redemption, his main book, he argued that the eternal life of Israel was a life beyond the state and nation, and what he called the eternal way of Christianity was an attempt to embed all of the Gentiles, all of the nations in the diasporic life of the Jews, that is, an eternal life. Once again, in a form of empire of creatures. And Erik Peterson argued in around the same time that the election of Israel was an election of a form of life against the life of the nation as well as the states. The Chaldean Abraham, who became Abraham in the desert, did not only flee what Peterson, like Hassoni, calls an empire. He fled the world of national gods, or what is usually called polytheistic deities in religious history, namely gods that tie us to the state, polis, or what we today would call a nation. And this is the word Peterson used, by the way. He uses the word nations in different texts, and the context for his writings are the First and the Second World War, of course. So the polytheistic deities were often rulers or protectors of what was called eternal cities, such as Babylon, Jerusalem, Tyrus, Alexandria, Rome, and belonged to the world of empires that the Chaldean Abraham abandoned when he left Ur and became Abraham in the desert. There he constituted a people whose God of all gods and Lord of lords promised a coming kingdom beyond the cities and nations of this age. And the Jewish exegete Philo would much later argue that the Jews revealed the city beyond the cosmopolis of nature, and therefore beyond a fragmented humanity that after Babel was structured into nations. Soon finished, by the way. But this flight from Ur was not a defense of the nation, according to Peterson and Rosenzweig, which it is according to Hassoni. It was the discovery of a new anthropology, namely a discovery that the human does not ultimately belong to the nations, empires, or polytheistic deities. The human is a creature among creatures, and creatures belong to the Creator, to God. And perhaps I should skip this. Well, I can just say this, that Rosenzweig, in a critique of one of Cohen's most problematic texts called Deutschtum und Judentum, Rosenzweig wrote that all true peoplehood has its grounded history. But history is exactly the life of the nations. And according to Rosenzweig, it is this life that the Judaic life and also the Christian life should transcend. So he uses the concept of history in an Hegelian way as a notion of collective struggles. So there is this form of ahistorical or anti-historical element in his theory of Judaism and Christianity. So there is this capacity to transcend history or transcend the history of the nations and the states. And I mean, this may seem strange, but you know, humanity has lived most of its life before the state and the nation. So in contrast to the life of the Gentiles, the Jews have been elected to live outside the order of states and nations in order to reveal to humanity the possibility of an existence beyond history in this sense and beyond the state. Rosenzweig writes in a text that even in his classical times, even in his own country, the Jew has never been a human of the polis, policemensch, or a slave of the state, Staatsklave, as the ancient man. The modern word state, Rosenzweig argued, does not even exist in classical Hebrew, and for him the Jewish kingdoms during the biblical period were either ruled by an anti-political priesthood or a meta-political prophethood. They were paradoxically not political kingdoms and therefore not nations. So Rosenzweig argues that the revelation to Abraham was a revelation that of not only Israel, but humanity as such did not belong to a specific piece of land or to a specific nation. Humanity belonged to what he called the supra-world, Überwelt. And I will go further. And so the nations belong to the gods, the imagined gods of history, and therefore to what both Judaic and Christian tradition would describe as fallen angels. And this is the world that we are living in now, according to both Rosenzweig and Peterson. It's a life of a fragmented humanity that are ruled by different powers, by different imagined gods or fallen angels. And this myth of the fallen angel is what Peterson emphasizes in his theory of the nations in several texts. And he argues that all nations belong to angels and therefore to polytheistic deities, whereas Israel belongs to God as such. So the fall from paradise, the fall into the world of states, nations, and empires implies a civil war in heaven. Satan or Lucifer falls and we have a cosmic conflict. And this civil war is characterized by the sundering of humans into nations and into a world that is not whole, that is not an Überwelt or a suprawelt. So Christianity for Peterson is the path that seeks the conversions of the nations into the order of Israel so that the Gentiles too can belong to God as such. And this implies the need for unity. And then so initially, several church fathers, Peterson points out, such as Origen, and Eusebius, argued that the Roman Empire, and especially its Christianization, could become such a global world beyond the nation. Yet with the decay of Rome, the church as such was more and more seen as such global community. And the interesting thing is that this perspective, of course, implies another form of theology and anthropology, an anthropology that defined the human as a creature belonging to a creator, and a theology that insists that the meaning of human life lies not in our past, but in what we can become, new creatures or even gods, or at least creatures belonging to what Rosenzweig called the supra-world or Überwelt. Thus, against the attempt to root humans in existing communities, such as nations, They insisted that we belong to a common world, the super world, a new earth and a new heaven, beyond the orders of the fallen angels and the polyadic deities of the empires, tribes, and nations. And this may seem to be an argument that only concerns believing Jews and Christians. Yet what these thinkers show is that Anderson is right, that there have not always existed nations, and that Hassoni may be wrong. Humans can and do exist in other communities than the nation. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mårten, and I immediately pass the word to Ragnar, please.
Thank you, and thank you for that lovely paper, Mårten. It seems like we do have quite a lot of interests indeed. And although I won't approach this topic in exactly the same way as you did, I do hope you'll find some common interest and directions. Now, I don't have a PowerPoint to show you, I'm afraid, so you'll have to bear with me. As I understand it, the Christianity and Nationalism project at the CTR at Lund seeks to explore the role of Christianity in the contemporary resurgence of nationalism and populism. Among the attempts to understand these political upheavals, one prominent approach has been to draw the contours of a certain crisis of representation. The symptoms of such a crisis are manifold: low voter turnout, a deterioration of party systems and affiliations, a growing distrust of politicians and established media, new political cleavages, as well as social and cultural turmoil. To approach these symptoms as part of a crisis of representation is to think of them as indications that the gap between the people and the representatives has become too large, and that this condition has some permanence. Now, if we understand the crisis of representation, and of course that's a mouthful, it's a big theory or a big subject really. If we approach this big topic, we might ask what role Christianity has played in it. We might also ask questions about what precisely Christian believers ought to do in such a moment. Yeah, we may also ask questions about where theology ought to speak, about the place where a theological response to the crisis of representation might begin. Given this representational crisis of modern societies, on what level, in what general context should Christian theologians formulate their response? Now, in this paper, I will explore one possible answer to this question. And what I'm doing here is both sort of a preliminary matter and also exploratory. So you will have to bear with me, and I'd love to discuss this further with you. What I will do is I will suggest that we ought to develop our understanding of the crisis of representation one step further by viewing it as a sign of the broader unintelligibility of the social world. And then I will try to make an argument, or at least an attempt to say that it is precisely the place and times of unintelligibility to which theologians ought to attend. Now, while modern societies are democratic, democratic power is always mediated through processes and institutions that put a wedge between the government and the represented people. Hence, the idea of representation is as vital as democracy for understanding modern politics. The representational structure of modern society involves a strong demand for transparency while handling the difficult task of government in and of a diverse society. The structure of representation exists to create, authorize, and restrict political power. Representation depends on a division between the state and society, because the government, the holder of power, is never identical to the sovereign power as such. Now, while there's a much more detailed story to tell about the specifics of political representation, and I will not tell the story here, my concern is with how the concrete processes of representation are part of a more fundamental social dynamic or social structure. And I am drawing on one strand of French political thinkers, including Claude Lefort and Pierre Rosanvallon, who have argued that concrete political processes are part of a broader attempt in societies to determine and change the fundamental symbols, discourses, practices, and norms by which society makes sense of itself. Politics, the concrete politics of daily life, is enmeshed in the dimension of what they call the political, the fundamental contest for determining the symbolic structures of society. Understood in this manner, the crisis of representation can be approached as a condition in which the fundamental premises of social action have become disputed. During such a crisis, social identities or actions cannot be made sense of to the same extent. Now, I believe that the history of modern theology is intertwined with this broader social project of sense-making. The search for intelligibility and transparency became a significant way in which modern theologians taught about their work in relation to the social order. As much of European theology oriented itself towards ethics are realms that sort of became something like the ontology of social relations. The theological task turned into clarifying some of the fundamental symbols by which a society could become intelligible to itself. Now, this interest in social intelligibility could be directed both internally towards the church and externally towards broader society. Thus, Schleiermacher, for example, his vision of theology oriented itself, at least partly, around the explication of the historical and contemporary communal self-understandings of the church. In the Hegelian tradition, as another example, for it, religion became an essential part of the social intelligibility of society as a whole. Without the role of religion in determining what Hegel called the subjective dispositions of the people, there is no point in having objective institutions like public education, civil society, or the state, he argued. The Christian universal, if you want to put it like that, was practiced, worshipped, and preached, but thus contributed to making sense of the social world in which people lived. And now, it is this sort of argument that allowed some theologians to find a place for the explication of the universal categories of the Christian communal vision in the modern world. Now, I'm not aiming to prosecute a traditional liberal theology at this point. Clearly, an essential part of the theological task is the explication of social intelligibility, or how human beings may relate and coexist in a peaceful manner that respects the integrity, dignity, and liberty of everyone. At the same time, I do think there's something to the suspicion that Christian theology, as with Christianity in general, has at times been reduced to nothing but a supplier of broad and inclusive symbols that supposedly help us towards better representation and social integration. And one could present a critique of this tendency by underscoring the responsibility of Christian language and practice towards God, and I think one probably ought to. Yet one could also approach it from a slightly different angle by taking one's cue from Karl Marx. As some of you might know, the Marxist critique turns the Hegelian analysis on its head. It accepts the claim that religion is a supplier of a range of fundamental social coordinates, but then it charges that these coordinates amount to a bourgeois ideology that justifies and veils social inequality by promising a freedom only finally gained in heaven. Religion then provides a mode of social intelligibility for its adherents at the price of sustaining deeper unintelligibility. The existence of religion in a society is a marker that it has failed to make sense of itself, and which therefore displaces the society's point of coherence to an otherworldly realm. Insofar as religion helps us represent ourselves, then it also misrepresents ourselves because it forecloses possibilities of change. Marx then reminds us that making sense of oneself is not an unequivocal good, as those who have been told to remain in their deprived status can certainly appreciate. Now, while this Marxist critique might make the possibilities for theological thinking seem poor indeed, As you might be aware, this critique actually inspired a broad theological program. Latin American theology, for one, turned social unintelligibility into a fruitful starting point for theological action and reflection. It argued that the governing structures of representation structurally excluded those who are most vulnerable and cemented bourgeois capitalist identities so that everyone, including Christians, were induced to overlook the poor. Putting praxis ahead of a theoretical concern for representation, they drew attention to the fact that the gospel of Jesus Christ implied a commitment not only to the intelligibility of the world, and not even primarily to that, but to suffering with it, taking responsibility for it, and being led by it. Hence, theology could, for at least some liberation theologists, be understood as the ideological moment in a revolutionary praxis, which was oriented by and from the position of the poor, a position outside the hegemonic regime of representation. Now, in this final part of this paper, I want to take a cue, and only a cue, from this direction in liberation theology. And I'm not, at least here, trying to develop other themes in that tradition further. If we were to accept some of the theological and ideological concerns with the modern structures of representation, one consequence would be that Christian theology should be especially concerned with those places where the governing modes of representation have failed. So where representation fails. Now, this is not necessarily to sort of delve into a moralistic discourse of giving voice to the voiceless, although it is worthwhile to include groups and individuals into institutions and public awareness. If we just remain at that level, we miss the opportunity to rethink exactly how Christian belief stands or might stand in relation to representation. Historically speaking, Christianity has made a sundry contribution to the idea and reality of representation, both in the church and in political life. And thus, a responsible theological suggestion about what Christianity may contribute today must naturally read its history with and against the grain. Hence, I would like to explore just some possible consequences if we took social unintelligibility as the starting point for theological reflection. What would a theological reflection look like that dwelled with the places and times where the governing social fabric has been torn? Now, first of all, I do believe that there are good reasons for theology to hold governing modes of representation at arm's length. As only a preliminary matter, I believe that a proper account of created finitude must acknowledge the ultimate opacity of human existence, both on individual and social levels. Thus, while a structure of representation geared towards ultimate transparency may very well work for some time, a theological critique of such a structure ought to point out the problematic consequences of a search for what is, in fact, a God's eye point of view. To be sure, Christian practice and discourse does and ought to promote a horizon of intelligibility. For what is the gospel, if not also a promise of a community, a mode of living in a context in which social actions make sense? However, what I take to be a significant insight from a long tradition of theological reflection is that this horizon of significance, this open welcome into the community of divine life, ought not to be understood as a call to enter a univocally defined frame on which social life becomes meaningful. Whatever we mean by living the life together in Christ, we are not speaking of entering a stage, the backdrop of which is the Christian truth. One could argue that if theologians are overly concerned with representation, they will always risk erecting an idol in Jean-Luc Marion's sense of the term, sort of a frame or a reflective wall of some sort. And in the Nordic context, Petra Karlsson, of course, who presented the previous resonance seminar, has developed a theological critique of representation in this direction. to practice the Christian faith is inevitably to engage with a set of very particular symbols, and explicitly or implicitly to engage with a specific communal vision. Nevertheless, it is not a practice in which transparency necessarily precedes intelligibility, or where the Christian symbols of community ought to function as a reference for univocal determination of social action. Thus, just to sort of give a nod to the question of nationalism, when, for example, Benedict Anderson notes Hegel's claim that reading newspapers is a modern nationalistic substitute for the morning prayer, we ought to be, at least from a theological standpoint, moderately suspicious, even if we might be right in historical terms. In that case, we need to sort of read our history against the grain. Because on theological grounds, we may certainly say that the practice of prayer sustains a sense of belonging, of temporal and transspatial coexistence, and we may, in that sense, compare it with a nationalist imagination. Yet prayer is also a mode of destabilization, a place in which the believer opens herself up to be changed, both by God and her fellow believers. Now, therefore, as Sarah Coakley and many, many others have argued, prayer may put into question precisely the horizons of representations to which we have committed. Hence, ultimately, a Christian is, as Barth once noted, one who is strange to himself and his fellows. Thus, a Christian approach to representation ought to admit some modicum of risk. One consequence of the gospel is, or could be, that Christians must wager that intelligible social interaction is possible even in those places where we have no stable point of reference. And this is where I think this is one place where liberation theologians found a convergence between the Christian notion of faith and love and a revolutionary praxis, this sense of hoping and believing before you have a frame within which you can orient yourself. Ultimately, I think the Christian faith implies that communal life is more fundamental than any regime or representation. Thus, it follows that we must challenge the assumption that we can only safely engage with each other if first we recognize everybody as subjects, as formally identical bearers of rights within a determinable space. It may have to involve a perilous search for and cooperation with modes of living among people that are not adequately represented, being open to the fact that there could be ways of acting and thinking that are valuable precisely because they do not fit into any large regime or representation. However, this will also involve a risk of becoming unwitting partners with reactionary forces that want to reshape society to become a place where only their sense of identity is acceptable. Thus, facing this risk also means detecting where a sense of dislocation and underdetermination threatens to become a starting point for a project of domination and recapture. As I argue that we should engage with the places where governing structures of representation fails, several questions may arise. Am I arguing for a post-representational politics, one that may stray close, for example, to the atheistic immanentism of Jean-Luc Nancy or the event-oriented philosophy of Alain Badiou, for example? Briefly put, I would say no to that question. I do not think that we can reinvent politics through a philosophy of bodily touch or an empty faith in singularity, because such a withdrawal from the symbolic will always lead to an oscillation between a commitment to an inexpressible communal dimension and a feeling that every particular expression or institutionalization is a betrayal of the original calling. So even if our age is characterized by empty symbols of progression on the one hand and populist uses of nationalistic or religious imaginary on the other, I still do not believe that we can take leave of the symbolic altogether, and therefore we cannot let go of the question of representation even when we work theologically. So finally, what am I proposing here? What sort of theological universals can be formulated in such a context? Now, I think a Christian political theology will necessarily formulate its symbols and notions with at least some relationship to the church. However, more than the church being a solution to the crisis of representation, it might be that the crisis is first and foremost an opportunity for the church to relearn something about its language and processes of representation. And I believe that one of the things it may learn is to operate in this space between hegemonic social worlds and their deterioration. To operate wisely in this space includes, among other things, an eschatological orientation that inflects the status of our symbols by which we make sense of ourselves. There's a peculiarity to the Christian universal, and of course the term is problematic in itself, but there's a peculiarity to the Christian universal in this sense that in that point where sort of all the lines converge, where the symbols of divine community create a unifying context in which everyone gained their rightful place, precisely there is the place where the symbolic opens up beyond itself again. So the completion of the universal is its own opening. Hence, the church's fickle nature as a political identity, entity. On the one hand, the church is a public place of gathering and sharing of life across every division, ideally speaking. On the other hand, it constitutes itself as a society through an act that points beyond itself, not simply to God up there, but to the kingdom, the unity of all human beings with each other and with creation. What is enacted in the Eucharist, for example, is undoubtedly a representation and a realization of community, in a very small scale, of course. Nevertheless, insofar as the Eucharist stages social unity, it already points away from itself and ultimately towards all humankind. Thus, whatever transparency we may approach in a Christian community must constantly be challenged by the destabilizing eschatological status of Christian symbols and practice. And finally, to end the paper, this eschatological character might enable us to think theologically outside the church as well. The church exists to articulate a different way of being in the world, and imitates in that sense a different city. Yet the difference it articulates is ultimately the difference of the world as changed through Christ. And thus, as Herbert McCabe once wrote, the church exists to show the world to itself. In that sense, theological reflection may too contribute as peoples and groups beyond the ecclesial context seek new sources of intelligibility. However, offering that theology, the offering that theology may present to such people should not be the promise of a new context of complete transparency, lest we betray the eschatological mode of faith.